this, I didn't have a Jun workshop. I mean, a Jun SCOBY. I didn't have access to one, but it was the first thing that came to mind that I wanted to share with everybody. So I put it out to the group, and Jackie said, "Oh, I used to have one, but I don't. But I'll keep my eyes out for one." And one of my customers, I'm a beekeeper, and I harvest and sell honey. That's what I do for a living. It's pretty amazing. Quickly, I'll just say I get like a giant reset out in nature on a regular basis, being outside with the bees and in the full sun and around plants. It's pretty amazing. But one of my customers bought a quart of honey and just happened to interject that she had gotten a Jun SCOBY from Kombucha Camp with a K, kombucha and camp with a K. And I let her know I was in need, and she brought me a SCOBY back within like a 2-week period of time. So I'm going to pass that on in the same method and offer it out to everybody here. If you don't have access to a SCOBY, hit me up. I really don't have a great personal social media, but I'll give you some contact information for me at the end. Plus, you can find me at my business profiles on social media. Our company name is Hani Honey Company, H-A-N-I Honey Company. But yeah, I would love to share some of these SCOBYs with you all, and then after a couple of you receive them, if you could do the same, grow some and pass it on. I love fermentation, period, exclamation point, other symbols, just enthusiastic overall about anything having to do with fermentation. Beverages in particular are something I enjoy making in fermentation. I have my comfort zone ferments and ones that I'm a little less comfortable with, like vinegar, but I'm getting a lot more comfortable with them. So the other thing I want to do is encourage you to experiment, especially right now, if you have things that are available to you to experiment with. Where I live is pretty much abundant in harvest of many fruits right now. We just had like mango mania. There were more mangoes than anyone should be allowed to have in some of our yards, and we pass on what we can and we ferment the rest and freeze some. And I see orange right now. I have 2 pet pigs, and they're both like extremely rotund because all they've been doing is eating mangoes that have been dropping for weeks and weeks on end. Pineapples, we have lots of pineapples right now, and a lot of our farms are still overabundant in harvests of even leafy greens and cucumbers and things that we don't normally have access to in late July. So as far as like food security and eating locally goes, I feel extremely lucky at the moment. So I've got lots of stuff to ferment with. So Jun is a really fun thing to make, and if you haven't ever tried it, you probably tried or know about kombucha. Everybody has heard about kombucha. It is constantly on the upswing in popularity. It's an amazing ferment. It's very easy to make, as well as Jun. And the main action of fermentation is performed by a group of yeasts called Saccharomyces. We all love Saccharomyces yeasts because they love to convert things, sugars and starches, into things like alcohol, and they work really well with our grains to make our breads. The list is endless, but there are different strains of Saccharomyces. Hence the kombucha SCOBY and the Jun SCOBY. I've tried to interchangeably use the kombucha SCOBY for Jun, and the type of Saccharomyces that is predominant in kombucha kind of craps out after a period of time when consuming honey, whereas with just conventional table sugar, just like a big huge jolt of glucose and no other complex sugars, the kombucha Saccharomyces SCOBY does very, very well. It also is pretty synonymous, the kombucha SCOBY, with black tea, but I know you can use other teas. I'm going to try to throw in as many like frequently asked question answers as I can as we go through. So the type of tea is usually black tea for kombucha. You can use other teas, but I've always been taught that any plant material or herb or tea, like we'll use rooibos, for example, is a great tea that doesn't have caffeine, but it does have somewhat of an oily composition is not necessarily a great tea choice for kombucha or jun. So I usually say this when I share ferment information. It's great to experiment and don't hesitate to do so, but if you can and you have access to it, try to start with following a recipe, utilizing the ingredients that are shared in the recipe, and you'll probably experience a great deal of success that way, and then you can start incorporating some of the other things that you have at your disposal. So where kombucha does really well with the black tea, and it has the specific Saccharomyces that likes sugar, the Jun SCOBY does really well with green tea and honey. And as I shared with you, I have a beautiful SCOBY that somebody gave me, and I've already prepared some nice Jun. It's a couple weeks old, and it has a really nice SCOBY on top. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna make some more Jun together, and we're going to decant some of this mature Jun out and put it in a bottle that has a top so that it's going to restrict air and promote some carbonation naturally, which I really like a lot. And we're going to talk about the tea that I'm using. I mentioned green tea, but I'm going to tell you right now that we have at our disposal, I don't know if everybody is from Florida or not, it doesn't matter. But this particular plant, I say Yaupon, some people say Yaupon, Jackie says Yaupon. It's a specific plant here in the holly family that grows, and we have a company in New Smyrna Beach called Yaupon Brothers. Really cool folks. I mean, amazing, amazing people. Growing a superfood secure tea, full of antioxidants, very similar to a green tea. It can be fresh or dry roasted, so there can be different flavors. I highly recommend checking these guys out. And I prepared all of this Jun with Yaupon. I grow Yaupon in my front yard. It completely tolerates sandy soils and very low irrigation and very hot temperatures, and stays perky, green, and beautiful. I haven't harvested any of mine yet because it's really a tiny little bush, but and it seems to be fairly slow growing. But you could also contact Yaupon Brothers and get a kit to grow your own. They have now they sell plants and also kits. So really awesome tea, grown right here in the good old US of A, which I think is amazing. So we don't have to go too far to get food that's good for us. So to get this Jun fed today, we're going to decant some of the mature Jun out. I've prepared in a half-gallon mason jar a half a cup of loose Yaupon tea, and you'll notice I've only filled it a little over halfway because I used the boiling water. I wanted it to have a chance to cool down so we could actually utilize it while we're together today. So I'm going to show you. Actually, I forgot to get the cold water out of the fridge, so we'll do that in a minute. But what I do usually is I brew the tea a little strong, and as it's cooling and I have the ability to, I'll add cooler water to it. I want to make sure that the tea isn't super hot when I do that though, because I don't want the glass to crack. So just be careful when you're working with hot and cold beverages in any glass containers. Most of these jars are pretty darn durable, but shocking it with really cold liquids can break it. So I used a half a cup of the loose Yaupon tea, and I'm going to try to make a half a gallon in total. And I put a half a cup of honey also already in the mix because I wanted it to dissolve completely. And this is a really cool spoon that I have that a friend of mine up in Vermont carved out of, I think, a birch tree. And I think it's cool to have things like this around, like cutting boards and other things that are made and stick around in your family for a time, and maybe you ferment with them a lot. And for me, I like to think of this as something that collects good microbes over time. I rinse it, I dry it, I leave it in a place that I'm comfortable with, but I feel like it's kind of absorbing and imparting something cool every time I use it. So the honey is completely dissolved in the tea now. There is still loose tea in here, so we are going to have to do a little bit of straining to get the tea leaves out, but we'll talk about that in a second. So let's look at our mature Jun, which we have here. This is a 2-gallon glass container that has a nice lid. I particularly don't seal kombucha or Jun all the way. I like to let air get in a little bit, not entirely, because I don't want to make vinegar and introduce a lot of acetobacter. So I do like a lid on a slant with a little cover, like a little loose towel or cover on the top. But I cleaned my hands really well before I started, so I'm comfortable handling this Jun SCOBY with my hands. If you aren't, you can use a utensil. Some people think metal is not the best thing to use with things that are acidic, but I think for such a quick maneuver, it would be fine. But I'm just going to go ahead and use my clean hands, and I'm going to take this out. It's a little delicate. Here's this beautiful Jun SCOBY. I'm just going to put it aside. And now I'm going to decant into my flip top bottle. What's nice about the flip top bottle is this lid is going to handle a lot of pressure once it's put down. The other thing is this is a really strong and dense glass. But anytime you're working with something that might carbonate, don't hesitate to put it inside another container, like a 5-gallon plastic food grade bucket or something, and keep it in a cool, dark place. Inside the bucket, if it were to explode, you'd have a lot less of a mess than you would if it was out of the bucket. So I hope these tips help you. Once the Jun is mature to your taste, basically the Saccharomyces has a chance to convert all of the sugars out into beneficial microbes, and the flavors start to change from sweet to sour. And there's like a nice change from the sweet all the way to the sour, so you can taste it as often as you like. You can then decant it and drink it. And I like to decant as much as I'd like to drink out of the mature container and leave that aside, and then feed this and put it back in a cool, dark place to ferment again. So natural carbonation is something I really like, and sometimes you'll get a good little natural bubble right out of your mature container. Even like this, open to air, you'll be surprised how you'll have this nice little bubble in your mouth when you go to drink it, and that's exciting to me. One of the things that I like about brewing things like this at home is the natural carbonation that's available to you that isn't available in commercially made kombuchas and Juns. Almost every single one of them, short of a few that I know of, are CO2 carbonated. So, and that's okay, like no judgment. It's just something to be aware of. Like it's definitely like a forced carbonation. I like natural carbonation, and I'm happy to drink beverages that are prepared that way as well. But you have the opportunity to take your mature Jun now and add some things to it to get the leftover yeasts that are still in there and beneficial bacteria to convert those sugars, but not have any escape. So those gases will build up in there and hence will form your carbonation. So I took some blackberries, which are also pretty easy to find around here right now. If anybody's growing blackberries or you find them wild, we have a couple cool parks. One of them is called Halpatioke, and one of the places you can go to in Halpatioke Park, you have to get to by canoe only, and there's a bunch of thickets of blackberry bushes in there where you can go and pick blackberries and compete with all the wild hogs for some good berries. The high fruit is still there, the low fruit's all gone. But I've mashed these up pretty good in this mason jar, and I'm going to force them through into my flip top bottle with the handy dandy tool chopstick that I have here. This is some high-tech equipment, I have to tell you. And the flip top bottles are really nice to have. Just be aware that if you like to share things like your Jun or your kombucha or anything else that you make, you may want to like etch your name in on the side of your bottle, or at least use some masking tape, because they tend to go and not come back, these bottles. So I usually give them to people and tell them, if you ever want me to give you any of this again, you have to return my flip top bottle, with a little bit more of a threatening scowl, but I'm just joking. I would never do that. So we've got probably about a half a cup of berry mash that went in there. I don't know if any of you remember when GT Kombuchas first released their kombucha years ago. This is going to show my age a little bit. I worked in a health food store for about 15 years before I started beekeeping 13 years ago. So, and that's about half my age. So I remember when GT Kombucha first started rolling out on the shelves, and I was extremely excited because the only time I had ever seen kombucha before that was in a 32-ounce like brown glass bottle on the shelf, you know, in the health food store, unflavored, and it just said something about like the mother on it, and I had no clue what it was. It was a long time ago. So the first couple GT kombuchas I bought had, you know, raspberry flavor, strawberry flavor, mango, and at the time they used whole fruit. Like literally would have like big pieces of raspberry like floating at the top in like a little bit of like mature SCOBY snot, and I really had a hard time getting past that. Like I couldn't even, I would like pour that out just to drink the kombucha. But if you, my point is, if you're going to use whole fruit, you know, you're going to have a little bit of solids to tolerate with who knows what kind of texture. So fermentation is really fun in that way. Some people absolutely love that, and some people don't. As you know, I have a hard time with it, but once I get past that, I can't resist the beverage itself. So I'm going to decant a little bit of mature, you know what, I'm just going to be brave and pour this in here. And overfill it. Actually, it's not over full. The headspace is still a little low. It's just here. I like to fill the bottle so that there's about 1 to 1.5 inches of headspace. So just about an inch above the shoulder where it slopes in on a bottle, I think is great. So this is actually good, but it did start to sort of come up and out because it's pretty darn fermented already. And then just to give it something else to be excited about, I'm going to give it a little honey. Okay, so I'm going to let that sit for a minute so that the honey can drip all the way in. And now we're going to feed our Jun back and make sure that the temperature of the tea is body temperature. This is a little warm, so I'm literally going to excuse myself, and you'll probably hear me run to my refrigerator and then run back. So hang on 1 second.
Hey guys, Jackie here. While Jennifer is running, I just want to say that feel free to, if you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat if there's anything that's pressing, but also we're going to have like a question and answer period at the end. So perfect timing.
Thank you. That was awesome. So I went ahead and made this water cold earlier, like I said, so that when we added our tea to the mature kombucha, we didn't shock it with anything too hot. That's also the reason why I removed the Jun SCOBY, because I don't like to chance that I might add something that I don't want in there, and then I feel like I've given it a minute to you know, be away from that. And what I'm going to use to strain it, I have a really cool funnel that has like an insert that is a strainer, but I'm notoriously bad at putting the insert someplace that I think I'm going to find it, and then I never find it when I need it. So I just have a strainer bag that also works really good for the loose tea. And I'm also going to mention, after I take a sip of water, that a half a cup of loose tea is approximately 8 small size tea bags. And if you have the opportunity to get larger tea bags, it would be like 2 of the larger tea bags. So I'm going to go ahead and feed our mature Jun container, straining out all of the tea leaves. If you get some tea leaves in there, don't worry. It's not going to hurt anything. Literally, they will just sort of, you know, fall to the bottom or become partly composed into the SCOBY. It's just a matter of like texture and preference. But if you like to have your beverage not have any solids or anything in it, just straining it'll do the trick. So this is a little more headspace than I like to leave. You know, I'd really like this to be full, but I fermented this just like this to get this ready for this workshop, and it worked out just fine. But just to give you a better tip, I think generally speaking, it's really good to have the liquid volume basically taking up the majority of the container. That just gives everything that's trying to be alive in here a little bit of an advantage to do what it needs to do and keep other things out. So just as I shared before, I simply cover this with a loose cloth. I just had another strainer bag. This is just like a food strainer bag. I get these from a beekeeping supply company, but I know a lot of the brewing companies also sell things like that. So a brew supply place is a good place to get a lot of things that you need, including these flip top bottles. And now that all of the honey has had a chance to deliciously drizzle out of this funnel, I can close the flip top and give you a little bit of quick info about this. So this now has a chance to ferment and produce that great carbonation we talked about. I would leave this in a cool, dark place inside another container like a food grade bucket for about a week. And then I would pop it and check it. I would usually make more than one, or, you know, so I can test them and decide if it's ready. But that's up to you too, if you want to make 4 or 5 smaller bottles rather than one big bottle. Once you open it, you can put it in the fridge and enjoy a little every day. I didn't talk too much about the health benefits of kombucha or Jun, but those are pretty easy things to find out there in the internet. But basically, the Saccharomyces is doing such a good job of converting all the complex sugars in the honey into beneficial bacteria that we know is really good for our health. And it's delicious and refreshing. And I really hope you enjoyed this. One more thing I want to share that might pop up in the questions is the water. I use the most filtered water I can get, not necessarily distilled. I do like the water to have some sort of, minerals and or a little bit of life to it. But no judgment, use what you can, what you have. If your water, if all you have access to is city water or tap water and it has a lot of chlorine, you can aerate it in a blender or simply vigorously stir it in an open container to allow some of the chlorine to evaporate out. You can also try filtering it yourself. You can boil it, let it settle, then filter it. There's so many things you can do. All this, including the honey and the fruit and the tea that you choose, is going to affect your Jun overall. If you have any funk or odd things at the surface, don't be worried. Just, skim that stuff off. Find the SCOBY that you started with, if it's sunk or it's just underneath the funk, and use a big bowl like this with a little diluted apple cider vinegar and water. Wash your SCOBY, empty your container, make a new batch of tea with honey, and start all over again. And if it doesn't work again, let one of us know, because we're all going to share Jun SCOBYs with one another, and try again. You can also add a little bit of mature Jun along with the SCOBY from another person's batch, and that also might help get you going. But if it doesn't work, don't fear not. Just try again until it works for you. It happens to all of us. So I hope this has been exciting and fun and encouraging for all of you that have never tried this before. And if you have questions, I'm going to hang out and see what they are and talk with you for a minute.
Great. So yeah, I think if you're wanting to unmute yourself so that you can ask Jennifer any questions, I'm going to put my video on too, so it doesn't feel like we're all just talking to black squares. But there was, Jen, in the chat, there was a good question from Michael about the semi-closing. I don't know if Michael, you want to ask that, or if you just want to read that in the chat, Jen.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. Here, I'm going to read it to you.
Hang on,
So from Michael, okay, I make kombucha, but was never told about the semi-closing. Is that specific for Jun scobies or for both types of fermentation?
Oh, the semi-closing. Okay, so that to me is a choice that I made based on how things were developing as I started experimenting with fermenting kombucha. So I tried it with completely open, fairly closed, and then I just kind of found this happy medium that worked good for me. So I find that where I live and in my environment, that works really good. And I've always read not to close it entirely, but I've also met people who have left them open. So I was just sharing my technique.
Cool. Okay, so follow-up question from Michael, who doesn't have a microphone. Does it make a difference to leave so much of the original mother? I leave maybe a couple of cups when I decant.
It shouldn't. If you have a little bit, not too much. I mean, even you saw how big the diameter of this container is, the mother is going to really like grow into that diameter. And eventually, you know, more and more mothers will form and more will decompose and sort of be spent and fall down to the bottom. But I started with a really small piece and it was very active and it grew very quickly, where sometimes they seem more dormant or maybe like I took a kombucha SCOBY out of the cabinet last week and it's been sitting there for like 3 years. There was barely any liquid in there. I brewed some tea, fed it some sugar, and it's grown a new mother already. So it's pretty forgiving, I think. And Michael, yeah, I don't think you really need a lot. But if you're hesitant and you have more access to more, maybe try a larger piece and then maybe split it up and try smaller batches too.
I would like to say that Jennifer is like a wizard at maintaining the best starters, fermentation starters. So you should definitely get the Jun SCOBY from her. I have a kombucha SCOBY and a yogurt starter from her that are both like, I had a lot of trouble with both of those fermentations until I got the starter from her. And now it's like so perfect all the time for like over 5 years. So
that'll be my new job. I'll be the starter person for.
Yeah, you could have a starter library.
Excellent. I love that idea. Cool.
Any other questions? Yes, Michael's got a question. Is it needed to remove the new SCOBY that forms every time I decant? I heard to remove it, never knew that you can just leave it and let it decompose naturally.
So I have a lot more experience doing this with kombucha. Usually I have what you saw in the container would just become a SCOBY hotel. It would be like this much SCOBY and a little bit of liquid. So I've always left the new SCOBY in there unless somebody asked me for some and I took some out. So it's kind of like what Jackie said. I traditionally grow SCOBY and leave it all in there until somebody asks me for some and I give them some and then I feed my vat, but I usually don't take the new SCOBY out. It's usually always in there. Were there any other questions?
Yes, Anya has a question. Can you give a summarized chronology of the kombucha and or Jun process, starting from someone giving you a mother SCOBY? What's next?
So once I receive a SCOBY, I acquire some ingredients. If it's Jun, I would need honey and I would need green tea. In my case, I would use Yaupon tea because I prefer it, and it's grown right here, so I'm really excited about that. If it's kombucha, I would get some black tea of any kind. It doesn't matter if it's a Sam or orange Pico, whatever your flavor is, whatever your fancy is, and some simple, conventional, unfortunately, just table sugar, like white sugar. For some reason, the natural compounds that are in sugars are a little bit of an inhibiting agent to the kombucha actually working. So they say use crappy white sugar, and so I'm going to go with that. It's all converted out in the process. So from there, you need water to prepare your tea. For a half a gallon, I use about a half a cup of loose tea or 8 small single serving size tea bags. And for kombucha, that would equate to about 3/4 of a cup of white sugar, to a cup. You can use up to a cup. That's a lot of sugar, but some people do use a cup. And for Jun, it would be a half a cup of loose tea. Same thing, 8 small tea bags or 2 of those family-sized tea bags. And I used a half a cup of honey. I chose a honey that was very sweet on purpose, so it would have a lot of sugars to be converted out. But if you have honey that isn't super sweet, you can choose to go for more like a 3/4 cup to a cup of honey. Brew the tea, add the sugars while the tea is hot so that they dissolve, or the honey in the case of Jun. Allow it to cool. You can brew it at half strength and then add cold water. Just make sure that it's cool enough not to break the glass that you're working with if you're going to shock it. And once it is body temperature, anywhere in the 90s, you can add it to your SCOBY and let it ferment in a cool, dark place for a few weeks. You should see a new film forming on the top within a period of time. It can take up to a week or more before you see that, but that'll tell you that you're headed in the right direction. If it starts to get funky right after you get going, a little bit of mold starts forming on top, like I said, don't fear, just scoop that off, see if that corrects the problem. If it keeps growing, I would then prepare a apple cider vinegar dilution of water and apple cider vinegar. I don't have a specific ratio for that, but it's like half and half, I would say. So like a cup of water, a cup of vinegar. Then I would take my SCOBY out, wash it, discard what wasn't working, wash the container, and start all over again. And you should be back on track at that point.
So Michael has 2 more questions. So the first fermentation time for kombucha is generally 7 to 21 days. Is it similar for June?
Yeah. And, the warmer the environment where you are living, it could go a little bit more rapidly. If you're experiencing winter and or you live in a colder environment, overall ambient temperatures are in the 60s or 70s, it's going to slow down quite a bit. But where we are, and I keep my house in the 80s, so usually within 3 or 4 days, I start to see a nice film forming of a new SCOBY, and within a week, I'm almost ready to drink it. Within a week to 10 days, 2 weeks definitely, it's in good shape. The Jun that you saw today is about 2 weeks old, and I think the mother was looking really nice, actually.
Cool. And another question from Michael, and I bet he doesn't know that this is opening up a whole can of worms about food economics, but he hasn't made Jun before because honey is much more expensive than sugar. What are your tips or thoughts?
That is such a great question, and something that we should all be considering, because I mentioned in the beginning how I felt about food security. I feel like all food should be affordable and available to everybody. Honey is typically a little bit more expensive than sugar is. Honey is definitely a difficult food to produce. It takes a lot of effort from an insect that should be revered and is really struggling right now. And without them, we're all in a lot of doo-doo. So, I don't think sugar should be as cheap as it is. I don't know what to say. I find that in agriculture, when food is inexpensive, the farmer and or the person handling the food hasn't been treated fairly. And I don't think food should be too expensive for anybody, but I think the balance is not quite there. We try to keep our honey priced reasonably. There's a big curve out there for honey, and you can find inexpensive honey, but I would be careful there. If you ever want to talk honey, you can definitely reach out to me, because there's a lot of, if that's a whole nother couple hour conversation, we could do that someday. But I respect agriculture, and I hope that someday we get to a place where things are a little bit more balanced. So do the best you can with what you have access to. In the meantime, I respect all foods.
I'm going to go ahead and just put Jen's email address in the chat. So if anybody needs to, oh no, I just sent it to Michael Bryan because I don't know how to use the internet. Let me try that one more time. Sorry, guys. Okay, so now everybody has Jen's email address. So if you do have any questions, you can reach out to her. So this was the first of 5. We've got 4 more very cool classes. I'm next, yogurt on August 8th. Don't miss it. But yeah, so I think reach out to Jen with any questions. Hopefully we'll see you at future workshops. If you have any questions for me, reach out to me also. You all got an email from me today. And yeah, any other questions before we head out?
I just say,
can
go
I
ahead,
ask?
Matt.
I was wondering if you've ever tried to make like a SCOBY specific for like a certain type of tea or sugar. Like the June is specific for honey and green tea, like you said, right? Have you ever tried to like force one into a new thing by like
Sure.
selective breeding and stuff like that?
Sure. I have, and what I'll say is, you know, don't use your whole SCOBY for that process because they are very slow growing and they do adapt, and they don't always work. So just, you know, smaller containers. You know, keep notes. You have a good roll of masking tape or a nice notebook, and write everything down that you're doing so that when it does work, you've got something that you can refer to. But yeah, I've played with a bunch of different herbs and teas and different honeys as well. Pollen, I've used pollen because usually there's a lot of yeast in the pollen, and also some of the blossoms and leaves that we have that are on plants that grow here. Grape leaves, we have some muscadine grapes here that are ridiculous, and they're full of yeast, and so are the leaves. So yeah, absolutely.
Super cool. I have a quick question about bees as well, if you're willing to answer. I had a hive that got decimated by wax moths about in December of last year, I think. And I heard from somebody that we shouldn't reuse the hive, and I'm wondering what you think.
I actually would reuse the hive. You know, you could scrape down the comb that is there if you want to. The bees, any strong colony could clean that up pretty well. So unless you suspect some sort of disease or contamination, you know, it's very likely the bees can repurpose what is okay. They're extremely efficient at cleaning that up and utilizing it. So unless it's really funky, has a foul odor, or you know, just doesn't dry out and seem okay, I wouldn't. But then if it is okay, you know, you put it out in the sun, it gets dry, and the bees clean it up. It's totally usable.
Cool. Yeah, the moths I think destroyed the whole neighborhood.
Ah,
It was really sad. We had because I had hives that I would like see on walks around the neighborhood and stuff like that, and all of them had, you know, teeth marks. You know, totally destroyed. It was crazy.
gotcha.
And none of the mango trees fruited in the neighborhood, which was really
Wow.
interesting as well because their pollinators were gone, I guess.
Yeah, bees don't typically pollinate the mango trees here.
Oh.
Wasps and flies do, but this year in particular, they bloomed at a time when there wasn't really a lot else in bloom, and it was the first year in 13 years that I ever saw my bees pollinating our mango trees. It was really a neat sight to behold. I had heard about it, and I always thought people were mistaken. They said mango honey or, you know, bees pollinating mangoes, and I said mangroves, no, and sure enough, they will pollinate mangoes.
Interesting. I wonder what caused the ones in my neighborhood not to fruit then, because I just suspected it was the bees being gone, but maybe not.
We have years where our trees will flower and not fruit.
Yeah.
So
I think it's about the springtime weather.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
It was weird.
cool. Thanks for all the awesome questions, and reach out anytime afterwards. Happy to talk more.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I'll put this video up on my website in the future, hopefully in September when they're all done. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jackie.
Yeah.
Everybody.